Good morning. I believe it's about time for us to begin this morning. I guess if you're visiting with us, we are studying about leadership these for a couple months here. I guess rest of this month, and then me and Marlon will swap, and he'll come over and have a different topic. But we started several weeks ago talking about qualifications of elders, and then last week we moved into talking about deacons. So we're going to pick up there a little bit and review a little bit, and then hopefully wrap up talking about qualifications today. Just to get us started, if you want to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3, that's where we'll be for a good portion of the time this morning. And before we kind of review what we did last week, I just want to go back and read there in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we'll go back to verse 1, even though that's talking about elders' qualifications, just to kind of read it all together as we discuss. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first, then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Okay, so if you remember last week, and I think I remember where we left off. Johnny, you may have to activate my slides there so this controller will work. You know, just going back again, some of the stuff we talked about last week, you know, we talked about the word deacon not, I guess, being originally a word in the original Greek, that it, you know, came from the Greek word diakonos, where majority of the places that it's in the New Testament, it's translated as just simply servant or even minister, depending on what translation and how they translated it. But the direct translation of that word translates into servant, which gives us a huge clue as to what a deacon actually is. You know, a deacon's no more just a servant. But there are a couple places where I think the technical word, instead of translation, is transliterate, where the translators took into account the context of where that Greek word was being used, and they actually translated or transliterated it, created a new English word, which is where we get the word deacon. I'll just throw some of these up here. So you've got a couple of places there, 1 Timothy being one of them, where they actually translate that word as deacon, because they, in looking at the context, saw that this was talking about for lack of a better word, a special servant, or as we look at as a position or office in the leadership, you know, and gave it the title of deacon. And these are just some places where we see it. And we talked a little bit about Acts chapter 6, where a lot of times we see that as the first examples of deacons, even though the word deacon is not in that story there. But that's where we look to get kind of examples of what deacons maybe do. Sort of the interesting thing about when we talk about deacons is, if you exclude Acts chapter 6, we're not really ever given any examples of what deacons actually do, other than going by their title or by the word that we use, that they're servants. So you fall back onto the leadership of the elders to determine, I guess, what deacons do in serving them and serving the church. And again, 1 Timothy being the only place where we're actually given qualifications of these servants, and that's where we're kind of at today. And I believe we talked about kind of their character, that they must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain, all similar qualifications that we also read when you talk about elders. Then we looked at their sort of spiritual characteristics, that they must be faithful, have a clear conscience. And then again, if you go with the assumption that most people do, and it's a fairly safe, I think, assumption, if you go assume that the men being described in Acts chapter 6 were, deacons, you can go there and get a few other qualifications there when the apostles are telling the people to choose these 7 men. And that's just how they described, or the requirements they put on those 7 men was that they be of good repute, full of spirit, and wise, which agrees with the qualifications that's listed there in verse 9 of 1 Timothy chapter 3. I think that takes us to where we left off, which will be verse 10 of 1 Timothy. I don't believe we got into this last week. So what does verse 10 tell us that a deacon also must be, or what instruction is given? Must be tested first. We don't see that when we're talking about qualifications of elders, do we? In 1 Timothy or in Titus, when we look at the elder qualifications. Why do you think Paul instructed them to test the deacons first? What is it? How would a person be tested? Observed over time. Definitely be. That's kind of how I guess we do it nowadays a lot of times. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess going a little bit further than maybe just observing someone. If you see, and this, in my mind, would fall back on the elders. If they see a man who they think would be suited well for to serve as a deacon, they could approach, instead of just jumping straight to appointing them as a deacon, and then they get all these other responsibilities that normally come with being a deacon. You might take that person and give them a task or something, an opportunity to serve, and then observe how they do with that. How do they, going back to these other qualifications, how do they handle that responsibility, to whether it's, putting them in charge of some benevolence, or putting them in charge of, maybe fellowship activities that we do, and kind of see how they perform in that environment. Why do you think it's important for a person to be tested before they become a deacon?
You wouldn't want to put someone in there that was lackadaisical.
Right.
Irresponsible.
Yep.
Someone that if you gave them a task, did it part of the way,
Yeah.
but failed to finish it.
Right.
And if they cannot communicate with their brothers and sisters and accomplish something and prove themselves, they're not worthy.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's true.
So he could give him a responsibility and see if he's up for the task.
Yeah. So why do you think this was, and of course, these are just thoughts that were, I guess, not really told. Why would we why would we approach deacons this way and not elders in a sense? Or why would you not put an elder to the test first?
Which I think it could potentially be an elder if they start out right. Where an elder, being the term elder used properly, has already been there and done that.
Right.
And also, you already see if you want to pick an elder, you already see how the way of his life being in the past to that present time, and that's another way to determine if that particular person is suitable for the job.
Right.
And that goes again to the present elders that are there to determine if that particular person is going to be suitable for this job. So it's going to, it's still going to be up to the elders, but yet his previous life to that point to be picked up after, I guess the story of his life tells the type of person.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. It kind of comes to me. It comes down to the difference in what an elder is and what a deacon is. An elder, you can't really put them to the test and then make a decision. I don't think.
I've been to some congregations that don't have elders and deacons, and some evangelists, or evangelists, whatever, there's a movement in church where they see themselves as being equal to elders,
Right.
and they will, before appointing an elder, will put a test in a way, certain men and stuff like that. And they always want to see the test or put people in office who will prove to be loyal.
Yeah.
So
Could be a
stuff is going on.
right. Could be, and that could lead to some, I guess, touchy situations. I guess you could say. And to me, if you look at what things that, and we'll get into this in later weeks, what elders do, what they're tasked with, and what they're responsible with. It's real easy to take a deacon because, again, a deacon really has no, if you really get down to it, has no authority other than what authority the elders give them. Again, they're just a servant that we, give this title that, again, makes the organization and the work of the church flow better when you have these men serving as deacons. But again, when it really comes down to it, they're just servants, just like all of us are servants. So it's easy to take them and kind of give them, as we said, tasks to see how they do. But when you get into being an elder, there's so much, I guess, confidentiality and things that elders have to deal with that you really, that practice just, to me, wouldn't work very well. And two, I think, kind of as Mario said, when you look at the qualifications of elders, when you get into their experience where it says they, shouldn't be a novice or a recent convert, they're already going to have that experience anyway, if you're choosing the right men to be your elders. And whereas, at least in our culture, a lot of times, our day and time, deacons tend to be less experienced from that standpoint, tend to be younger in age in some cases, although that's not a requirement or necessary. That just kind of tends to be the way it works out. But I do think that's something that, I guess my main point bringing that up is that's something that even when I've read through it, I've kind of never really stopped and really thought about, that where it says put them to the test first. But to me, I think it is something we need to really think about when we're talking about deacons, because sometimes I've even seen it, churches I've been in, a lot of times people will take sometimes even maybe a fairly recent convert, but a younger man that they think, oh, well, let's put him in as a deacon because that'll help him get involved. It might be someone they think is, just not really getting really involved with things, and think, well, if we make him a deacon, that'll kind of, for lack of a better word, force him into taking some responsibility and getting involved. And they use that role as a way of, I guess, helping that individual mature. And then too, sometimes I've seen places where, not even to that degree, but you take someone, instead of testing them first, they seem to meet all these other qualifications, and you install them as a deacon, and instead of them having just one task to do, all of a sudden now they get overwhelmed real easy, and you can really burn an individual out if you just kind of, for lack of a better word, throw them into the deep end, so to speak.
Also, if, what you're saying about trying to take somebody young or new convert and all that, there's a way, and this is just, my thoughts is, if there's a deacon already in place, and he believes that a certain individual can be involved, or trying to make them involved into something, instead of taking them in as a deacon, what they can do is just kind of let them work under their wing.
Yeah.
And just kind of build them up for later, for the future, just to see if that would show if the person is gonna be, a good candidate for
Right.
being, to become a deacon. And that would be, and this is one way to get somebody involved, just for the deacon to maybe delegate some of their jobs
Yeah.
and oversee those young individuals to see how they think.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
That kind of, I was gonna play kind of off that, in several of the congregations we've been in, like there's been a deacon over a certain work, say audio visual, and they end up leading the congregation, or else is installed as an elder, then the person that they've kind of groomed, if he fits what the qualifications of a deacon, many times that's the person they bring up into the deacon of
Right.
that area. It's not that they're just over that particular area, but that's their main focus.
Right. And kind of where they start until they get more experience.
And many times, they get to that deacon level and they go, oh, they're asked, would you like to be an elder? And oh no, I'm very satisfied
Right.
being where I am. And I don't want, I appreciate the thought for the responsibility, but it's just not something I want to handle right now.
Yeah.
No, selection of deacons is largely the responsibility of the elders. It's supposed to awkward situation, there's a brand new congregation with no elders,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get it started.
Yeah. That could be a challenge.
That's awkward. I've experienced that,
It
and that is an awkward situation.
it is. And to me on that, a lot of times, and I've been places where, not necessarily new church, but congregations that don't have elders, a lot of times what they'll do, and I think you see that even in the New Testament, with Paul even, you'll bring in an outside person that you trust to help you, guide you through that, as for sort of as a consultant almost, and that can be very helpful, especially to a young congregation that's just starting, to bring in someone with that experience. More than likely somebody that's an elder somewhere else that can help, guide a congregation through that. And again, I think that's what you see here a lot of times, why Paul's circling back to make sure that those new congregations are following through with installing elders, because he saw how important that was to have that leadership.
Must have been really important, because he had to walk to go see.
Right, yeah, that's true. It wasn't, he couldn't catch a plane or jump in his car, that's for sure. And and he was a busy person.
Before we move on, there's I guess, we're all deacons in a way.
Right.
So all it is just basically it's a sermon. And, but there's in my mind, there is a little different between the deacon that is being appointed by the elders and by just the regular brother or sister in Christ.
Right.
So, but, like you said, last week that, the elders have to have so much that they need to be doing, so that they're gonna delegate some to the deacon.
Right.
But, in reality, we all are serving.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And I think, just, just the sure, I guess, logical, organizational structure of things is, you tend to have, your elders, even with your companies, you've got your CEOs and directors that then delegate things down to managers, and then that gets delegated further down. And as you go up, there's more responsibilities, more, I guess, commitment, so to speak. So that is sort of kind of the way we do with deacons is, they're that level of servants for the elders to delegate things to, and then help keep things organized and flowing well. So from a logical standpoint, it definitely makes sense that we do it that way. So the next, I guess, last kind of group of qualifications that we have for deacons is, again, going to be similar to what we see for elders as well. There it says, verse 11, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. And depending on what translation you're reading from, you may have slightly different wording there. So, husband of one wife. And by mentioning that, I guess, at least I would say that puts a requirement that they have a wife. There is some debate, I guess, among the world in general, and probably even among the churches, that maybe that's not putting a requirement that they have a wife. But we go back to some of the stuff we talked about weeks and weeks ago, is there's always a safe route to go. And to me, this seems to indicate that the intention is for a deacon to have a wife and only have one. Now, we know back in these times, it's strange for us to think about, but back then there were practices among some of the people back then to have more than one wife. So this was putting a limit on that.
I read something this morning, asked what's the disadvantage of having more than one wife? And the answer was having two mothers.
There might be some truth to that, among some other things. But again, even when you go back to elders' qualifications, it shows that, especially back then, that commitment to a covenant, which gives you some indication of how that elder or deacon's going to see the church and see their commitment to the congregation. And again, the interesting thing here is that in verse 11, it actually gives some qualifications for the wives as well, does it not? That they're to be faithful, dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded. So why do you think this? We're not told, but why put requirements on the deacons' wives?
Because that deacon's wife is going to be a helper to that deacon.
Right.
She's got to be the right type of person
Yeah.
to help him.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that there's no requirements on elders' wives, but I mean, I guess there's ways you can look at that. But to me, with deacons, you're definitely a deacon. Again, is just a servant, so that wife is most likely is going to be serving right alongside, that deacon as well. So it's important for them to have these qualities as well. And some of the things, again, the one example we have in Acts where these 7 men are looked to be a pretty big task because they were dealing with 2 groups of widows who weren't being taken care of, and some accusations going back and forth, it appeared. So it was not only just a physical need of feeding these widows, but you had some maneuvering to do with personality conflicts, their backgrounds and everything else. So, I mean, although a lot of times we see deacons as just taking care of physical needs, which, yes, that's true, but there's some interaction there, which I think goes back to why some of these qualities are placed on these deacons, is they do need to be able to communicate with individuals and deal with personalities and conflicts.
I'll say, and also, one of the deacon's qualifications of good repute was his wife has problems with slander and not being dignified, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's gonna hurt his
Help.
reputation.
Exactly, yeah.
And also, again, what God put together, not break the tie.
Right,
And since, a husband and wife are one, before God, so now the wife, she has certain jobs that she does that the husband does not do. So, and in most cases, believe it or not, the wife is the backbone of the husband.
right,
So, and she can be also an encourager, and she can be there for more support to help him to do his job better as a deacon and as a leader.
right.
So, God provided the wife and the husband to be able to do that as one.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you go all the way back to, I guess, Genesis. The whole reason for Eve was to be the helpmate for Adam. So, I mean, it's the same thing with deacons. And it is very important that their wives have this quality, because it is going to be somewhat of a team effort. And then also, these deacons are going to be asked to do a little more than maybe what they normally do. There's going to be nothing else. There's going to be time taken in serving in that capacity. So,
Well, it says the husband of one wife. If he has a family and children, he has proven himself at that point because of the way he has managed his family.
right,
He has managed his family well, he has proven himself.
right,
If he has managed his family not well, then he's not qualified.
right. And big similarity there between qualifications for elders and deacons is again, whether he manages his, my translation says children, but children and their household well is what ESV says. So again, that's your part of your qualification and vetting, I guess you could say, as Ms. Fromm mentioned. If this man can manage his own household well, then that's a good indication that he can, handle managing his duties as a deacon. And again, goes same as with elders as well. And just like elders, these deacons have spiritual qualifications that are required as well. Even though they're going to be doing a lot of the physical work, there's still a requirement there for them to be spiritual men with, like we said, clear consciences, good repute, those sorts of things. And I guess you see a lot of similarities between deacon qualifications and elder qualifications, which can cause some confusion for us sometimes, because qualifications are so closely tied, which explains why a lot of times somewhat the natural progression, at least in our day and time, is for someone to serve as a deacon, and then eventually, usually when you appoint elders, majority of the time it's going to be somebody that's already served as a deacon, mainly probably because these qualifications are so similar to one another.
Speaking of a can of worms,
You like those cans of worms.
because I was where you stood, and I'm hesitating to mention
Right.
Okay. In our culture today, the concern is marriage, divorce, and remarriage.
Yeah.
All right. So could that one wife thing be stretched some to say you need to take a hard look at marriage, divorce, and remarriage? And was that a scriptural
Right.
divorce too? And I know that's a can of worms.
Right. Yeah, for those that maybe couldn't hear, yeah, Bill, Mr. Frone, I knew that. I was trying to think how I was going to reword what you said. But, you know, when you talk about the qualification of one husband of one wife, a lot of times we know that probably even with elders had to do with back then you could, you know, it was customary and not unheard of for men to have more than one wife. And, you know, we can discuss why it's best for that not to be the case for an elder or deacon. But I guess what Brother Frone was mentioning is could that also be used to apply to what's something more familiar in our day and time where, you know, even in the secular world, you don't have multiple wives, at least not in our countries. But you do have a lot of divorce and remarriage, and you get into the questions of whether that's scriptural remarriage and divorce and those sort of things. So can that be taken and applied to that for this qualification? And this is just my personal take on it. I don't know if you can literally do that, but I think if you, and that's kind of in closing our qualifications for elders and deacons, you have to kind of look at the overall, well, yes, these are required scriptural qualifications. To me, these qualifications are also kind of painting a picture of what that man is, who he is, his character, his integrity, and those sort of things when you look at these qualifications as a whole. So to me, where you might not be able to take that husband of one wife and apply it directly to the divorce remarriage situation, I think if you have an individual who's got that in his past, I do think you need to look at that person, you know, not in a judgmental way, but if you're thinking about putting that person as a deacon or elder, you definitely need to look at that, all of those qualifications to make sure something hadn't been missed. Because while they might be fine as far as, you know, their salvation goes, there still might be some things in there that might make you question whether or not they should be serving in that capacity.
Well, the problem's going to be that the elders will know whether that's the scripture,
Right.
divorce or remarriage, but the general congregation is not going to know those specifics.
Right.
So it could cause
Confusion, conflict, yeah, and that's, yeah. Can you have deacons without having elders? I've read some stuff on that. I don't know that. I would say it would be hard and probably not a wise thing to do, just from what I've studied, just because, and that was one thing I was going to mention when we talk about the similarities between elder and deacon qualifications. They're so closely similar, but yet they're different. And then when you get into the responsibilities of elders and deacons, there is a very clear line there where the elders do have the authority. We're told a lot more about what elders are to do and very little about what deacons are to do. So the danger we run into that we have to be careful about is while a lot of times maybe the natural progression is for a deacon to become an elder at some point in time, we can't forget that when they are deacons and they're not elders. You know, sometimes we get in the danger of looking at deacons as maybe junior elders, and some of that's just a subconscious thing, I think, because they do work so closely with the elders, and the lines can get blurred there, I guess you say. So my thing would be the risk you would run is if you don't have elders, but then you have deacons is what ends up happening. Those deacons act as elders. I mean, it's, I would say definitely you could have elders and no deacons, because I don't see any necessary specific requirement. You know, Paul tells these churches to install elders, but I don't see, other than in Acts chapter 6, you know, if you assume those are deacons, that, you know, yes, the apostles decided that it would be good to have these men take on this responsibility so that they could focus on spiritual things. I do think if you're in a church that has elders and no deacons, you're in a bad situation, because if you don't have men qualified to serve as deacons, then what's going to happen when those men that are elders are no longer elders? So I think while it's maybe not a requirement, it's just kind of a common sense or natural thing that if you're a congregation, if you don't have deacons, then you should be preparing and teaching and you know, getting some men ready to serve as deacons. Yeah, I've lived in, you know, places, small towns where, you know, for a lot of reasons there were no elders, no deacons, and what you end up doing is men's business meetings, and it's not a fun situation to be in, and it hinders the work of the church, because you know, whether, you know, in our day and time, a lot of times we don't like authority and don't like people bossing us around, but at the end of the day, somebody's got to be in charge, and the Bible lays it out to where those people that need to have the authority to be in charge need to be spiritual men with these, you know, these qualifications. So,
Which brings us back to the qualifications of an elder, you know, well, their purpose, they're to watch over the flock.
yeah, oversee, right,
Right, and that's, you know, they're there to keep us sound, safe,
right,
and take care of some of the spiritual issues, which a
Yeah.
men's meeting can't do that.
yeah.
A group of deacons cannot do that.
The thing I've seen a lot of times when you go to the men's business meeting, and when you don't have men qualified to be elders, you know, it's not, you can't, the worst thing to do would be just grab random people and say, all right, give you the title of elder, but that's not fixing the problem. But the thing that I've experienced when you go to those men's business meetings, you end up talking about, you know, painting the walls and, you know, cutting the grass, and, you know, you talk about the physical things, you tend to not talk about the more important things of, you know, growing the church, spiritual things. I'm not saying that's always the case, but and sometimes that's because you didn't have men qualified to be elders in the first place. Now, there are, I guess, situations where you might have men who are very spiritual men, but their history throughout their life or some things in their life doesn't make them feel like they're qualified to be an elder, but yet they're still a spiritual leader because they're a good Christian man that's spiritual and trying to do right. So that can help in times, but again, you end up with that man who probably doesn't desire to be an elder because he doesn't feel he's qualified, sort of has to serve in that leadership guiding role. So again, it's why it's so important for us to study about it, because some of these qualifications, as we mentioned, you can't back up and say, let me go get that qualification. You know, it's something you have to start developing and working toward, you know, early on, so that you can be that, you know, type of person to fill that role one day. And again, sometimes it's life and it's out of our control and to some degree, but yeah, it's not an easy thing to work through sometimes.
I may not say this correctly, but a lot of times the elders can take some of the load, for lack of a better term, off the preacher. They can do the visiting and sometimes the counseling that an elder, a preacher may not exactly have the time.
Yeah.
Or be spread wide enough to be able to do it. Your deacons can come in and they fill in as you do here with other tasks at hand that frees the elder to do the things that assist the preacher.
Yeah.
You know, it's a package deal.
Yeah.
One doesn't work well without the other.
Right.
And if there's a personality situation or a responsibility situation
Yeah,
If everyone that is in a specific role is not fully qualified, they do not need to be recommended.
right. And I know Jake's had his hand up, but before I go to Jake, I agree with you, but I will say, taking a little bit further, uh, it's really the reverse. I think the preacher helps the elders with visiting and counseling, because if you really, and we'll get into this in a couple of weeks, one of the biggest duties or responsibility of an elder is to know his congregation, to counsel and help and guide. So it's, and I think is why deacons are important, because the elders can delegate some of those tasks, like making sure the building's not falling apart, so that they can go out and tend to those other things. One of the, I've read so many books, I don't remember who it was now that one of the chapters I was reading, but he was bold enough in saying that he felt like an elder should visit every member in the congregation within a year, which you think about how many members are in our congregation, and depending on how many elders you have, they could spend 90% of their time doing that. And sometimes that may be what they ought to be doing, is constantly going around. Today's times has been, I think Jim would tell you, if he's serving on security this morning, I think, but if he was in here, he would probably speak up and say that's one of their most important things that they do. But yet it's been a real challenge in the last 2 years for them to even be able to do that, for a lot of reasons, but one obvious one that, we're dealing with. But Jake, lost it. Right, so it would make it real. Right. Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. I don't know that you could logically have a congregation with elders or with deacons and no elders.
Sometimes the preacher is much bigger than the elder and the preacher.
I think you might be right, and I would say I don't know that there's anything in the Bible that says a preacher can't be an elder. Of course, in our day and time, in the early church, it probably wasn't as common for you to have a preacher that's all they did was preach and made a living preaching, even though it possibly was. But that again comes back to just kind of your opinions and whether or not that's a good idea. I mean, I know there are a lot of congregations out there where the preacher is an elder, and a lot of times the preachers do have all these qualifications. My thing is, I think, you get into some of those cans of worms that Brother Frome likes to open up for us on Sunday mornings, where if you got a preacher who in our society, preachers are paid, he's on our staff, he's paid. And again, going back to Jake's comment, who does he answer to? He answers to the elders. So if you got the preacher who's an elder, and depending on how many, you get into a lot of sticky situations in those cases. So most congregations, I think, kind of stay away from going that route, although sometimes it might be a necessary evil in certain situations. You'd have to weigh, if the only person you got qualified is the preacher and one or two other men, is it better to have the preacher as an elder than to not have any eldership? I mean, that's you have to weigh that then, I think. Ideally, I would say you would stay away from that for, like we said, it keeps things a little cleaner.
Like you said, if the preacher is an elder in that situation, and if that preacher is serving as an elder, he is mature enough and he's really got his arm in the right place, I would believe, like I said, it all comes about maturity.
Yeah.
He should go to a different congregation and ask if those elders will be willing to serve in that church.
Yeah.
This way, they'll take the burden off of him. The preacher will do his job, and
Yeah.
the congregation go for that, but you see, it's something, you have to have, like I said, somebody has to be in charge.
Right.
To do God's work, and it's a very sticky situation.
Yeah.
I think that's what, if you have a mature preacher and he really goes after, God, this is what probably would do.
Right.
Okay. Elders are overseers of the preacher. If the preacher has a problem that the elders need to confront, how do you handle that if the preacher is an elder?
Right. It'd be difficult, which I guess some folks would say that's not much different that if you've got, just, we'll talk about our congregation, Jim and Bubba are two elders. If Jim has an issue, Bubba has to confront, if they're the Christian men and have the qualifications they're supposed to have when we install them, then they ought to be able to work that out. But I do get what you're saying, which again is part of the reason why I say you're better off not having to go that route if necessary, because it does get awkward at the least.
Lots of preachers that had major issues, not only a lot of elders that have had
Yeah.
major issues.
Well, and I think too, just you take the workload of an elder and the workload of a preacher and put them in one person, and it's going to be difficult for them to do, even though sometimes, our preachers are counseling and visiting, which the same thing an elder should be doing, but you can get overloaded. Lee?
Well, I wanted to take it from another little can first. The manager's children, because this one gets close to home. What about a man that only has one child?
Yeah. We don't really have time to get in. We'll circle back to that in 2 weeks, but I do, and I'll go ahead and warn you now, I'm not going to give you a definite answer, but I have looked at that a little bit. I think you have to look at the husband and wife. There's some verbiage in there and the way the language is written, and you kind of got to be almost a grammar expert to go back to the original Greek and see what, and that's one of those that even in our brotherhood, people have differing opinions on. So we will cover that. And next week, so it'll be in 2 weeks, next week, I believe John Pigg's going to be teaching our adult class. He's going to come talk about the Mexico missions that he's doing. So he'll present, which works out convenient because I think me and Marlon are both going to be out of town next week taking the teens down to a youth rally in Starkville. So in 2 weeks, we'll come back to that and we'll finish up on the qualifications, and then we'll actually start moving into some of the roles going back to elders to get more in detail into actually what their duties are. So thank you all for your comments.